Born on January 30th, 1872, in Frauenburg, a small village in the South Bohemian Region of the Czech Republic, Eduard Bloch was part of a Jewish family who were described as being comfortable but not excessively wealthy. His grandfather Joachim worked for Prince Jan Adolf II of Scharzenberg, while his father was one of the first Jewish university graduates in philosophy from Charles University in Prague. After finishing school, Eduard studied medicine at the same university which his father had attended. He went on to become a medical doctor who served in the Austrian army operating out of Linz. Following his discharge in 1901, however, he decided not to return home, but to stay in Linz. Eduard soon opened up his clinic, which was also his family home. He lived with his wife and daughter Gertrude, who was still an infant at the time. He quickly gained a reputation as the poor man's doctor, as he served the underprivileged in his impoverished neighborhood, charging patients based on their income. More often than not, Eduard took nothing from those he treated. He was highly regarded by locals and a true pillar of his community. He would aid his patients at any time of the day or night, and was generous with his time. His practice soon became the most successful in the entire city. He later wrote as part of his memoir, quote, "I never made the slightest distinction between the treatment of rich and poor. I answered the call of every sick person, even in the coldest nights, so that my constant readiness to help became almost proverbial." End quote. Today, however, Eduard Bloch is most notable for one thing: his relationship with the Hitler family. In this episode, we are going to explore the life of Eduard Bloch, his relationship with the family of Adolf Hitler, and how this kind-hearted doctor was able to escape Nazi Germany alive. Welcome to Wars of the World. We all know that the internet can be a bit of a battlefield, and we can all do with a helping hand when we're online. Today's sponsor, Aura, is a fantastic way to keep all of your information safe, as well as providing a number of other services. Once you go online, a fair amount of your personal data will be available to anyone who knows where to look, which could include your location, your phone number, and more. Aura is able to find the data brokers selling your information and send a request for them to remove it, which is a legal requirement that not everyone has the time to request. Aura can help keep the rest of your family safe with parental controls, an antivirus, identity theft insurance, and more. This means you can manage your security online from one app, and you don't need to download multiple apps to do the same thing. It's all included in one affordable price. But luckily for my viewers, Aura is offering a 14-day free trial, so you can try it out for yourself. You can either surrender and let people continue to exploit your personal information, or you can go to aura.com/warsoftheworld to start your free trial today. In 1901, shortly after his clinic opened, Eduard began treating the family of Alois Hitler, who married Clara Pulzel, his first cousin once removed, in 1885. Shortly after the death of Alois's second wife. Their first son, Gustav, was born on May 17th that year, followed by their daughter Ida on September 23rd, 1886. However, both children died of diphtheria during the winter of 1887 and 1888. Their second son, Otto, was born in 1887, but died shortly afterwards. Their fourth child, Adolf, was born April 20th, 1889. Although Adolf Hitler was born in Branau, a tiny town in Upper Austria on the border with Germany, he would later move with his family to Linz. At age 16, he left school and spent time residing in Vienna, desperate to become a musician and artist. Throughout his life, he drew, painted, and wrote poetry. His mother even bought him a grand piano on which to practice his musical skills. On 2 occasions, he tried to gain acceptance in the Academy of Arts, but was rejected both times. It was suggested that he attempt to study architecture, which was deemed more suitable for his talents. However, Hitler had no such interest in this advice, and he continued to stay in Vienna, painting postcards with the support of a fellow artist who was notably Jewish. In January 1907, Hitler returned home. His mother Clara had been diagnosed with breast cancer after suffering from tremendous pain and having noticed a lump in her breast 1 year earlier. She told Eduard Bloch that she'd been so busy looking after the house that she hadn't had time to seek help from a medical professional. Unfortunately, Clara's prognosis looked bleak. Eduard told Hitler that his mother would need to undergo a mastectomy if she was to have any chance of surviving. Mastectomies at the time were still a fairly new and radical type of surgery. She underwent the operation, but during it was discovered that Clara's cancer had already spread and that her condition was terminal. Hitler subsequently moved back home to care for his mother, whose condition rapidly went downhill. By October, Hitler was so distraught by his mother's poor health that he begged Eduard to try some sort of treatment to prevent or at least drastically slow her looming demise. From November to December, Eduard began issuing iodoform to Clara, a horrific and experimental treatment which involved reopening her incisions from surgery and applying a gauze soaked in iodoform directly to the tissue to burn cancer cells. This painful treatment, which lasted 46 days, caused Clara's throat to paralyze and left her unable to swallow. She died on December 21st, 1907, from the side effects of iodoform. Hitler was devastated by her death. Eduard would later recall, quote, "In all my career, I have never seen anyone so prostrate with grief as Adolf Hitler." End quote. Bloch even referred to him as the saddest man I had ever seen when Hitler was first informed of his mother's illness. In 1941 and 1943, Eduard was interviewed by the Office of Strategic Services, an early version of the CIA, where he reportedly stated that the thing which struck him the most about Hitler was his relationship with his mother. Quote, "While Hitler was not a mother's boy in the usual sense, I never witnessed a closer attachment. Their love had been mutual. Clara Hitler adored her son. She allowed him his own way whenever possible. For example, she admired his watercolor paintings and drawings, and supported his artistic ambitions in opposition to his father, at what cost to herself one may guess." End quote. As the Hitler family was not financially stable at this time, Eduard reduced the prices of his treatments, and on some occasions, charged the family with nothing at all. Clara was succeeded by her only son Adolf, his sister Paula, and their 2 stepchildren. Following her funeral, the siblings visited Eduard and thanked him for his help. Reportedly, they would frequently express their gratitude towards the kind-hearted doctor, and upon returning to Vienna, Hitler sent the Bloch family a hand-painted postcard for New Year's over the next 2 years. He told Eduard, quote, "I shall be grateful to you forever." End quote. In 1914, when the First World War broke out, Eduard decided to do what he did best, to help the needy. He enlisted in the military once more and became an army doctor. His wife, Lily, was equally driven by a desire to assist the poor, the sick, and the wounded, and began volunteering with the Red Cross as a nurse. When the war came to an end in 1918, Eduard was rewarded for his hard work, being given the position of an important health advisor, which saw him be recognized for all that he'd done during his lengthy career. As one decade passed into the next, life for the Bloch family remained much the same, except for one uncomfortable detail: a distinct rise in anti-Semitic rhetoric, which seemed to be stemming from a politician named Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party, who had entered the political scene back in 1920 and rose to power in 1933. Eduard was not blind to what was going on around him. He would later note his belief that the working classes were attracted to the radical and hate-filled rhetoric of the Nazi party in response to what he described as, quote, "the previously unknown phenomenon of unemployment," adding, "poverty and hunger were the greatest enemies of morality." End quote. In March of 1938, Hitler visited Linz, his favorite Austrian city. Those citizens were ordered to have their lights on and their windows closed in an attempt to reduce the risk of assassination attempts. Some still celebrated out on balconies. By all accounts though, Eduard Bloch was not one of those people. He had his lights on and his windows closed as he looked down on Hitler's Mercedes driving through the street. He would later recall, quote, I stood for a short time at my window, full of anxious anticipation at the arrival. Standing up in his slow-moving car, Hitler saluted in all directions, including up at my window. I assumed that the salute was not meant for me, but for one of my neighbors, who is an enthusiastic Hitler supporter. I was informed the next day that this honor was meant for me. Straight after his arrival at City Hall, the Führer asked for me." End quote. Reportedly, just 1 year earlier, Hitler began inquiring as to the whereabouts and status of Eduard Bloch, asking whether or not he was still alive and if he was still working as a doctor. He reportedly called Eduard a noble Jew and an exception, adding, quote, "If all Jews were like him, there would be no Jewish question." End quote. In 1938, following the Anschluss, or the annexation of the federal state of Austria into the German Reich, life became increasingly difficult for Jews. On October 1st, Eduard was forced to close his medical practice. Later that year, Nazi Germany's secret police, better known as the Gestapo, paid a visit to the Bloch residence, but appeared to be under strict orders not to harm or greatly disrupt the lives of the family. The Gestapo reportedly demanded that the 2 postcards from Hitler be handed over, and the family were given a receipt in return. The Blochs avoided any major incidents, a surprise given that not only were they Jews themselves, but they were also sheltering Jewish friends and family. Notably still, the Bloch family were afforded a great deal of privilege due to Eduard's relationship with the Hitlers. Unlike many of their peers, they did not have to register their assets. They were allowed to keep their passports, and their ration cards were not marked with J's. Still, Eduard knew that their current environment was not a productive one. He was unable to practice medicine except on other Jews, as per a law which was recently put into action by the Nazi Party. Eduard decided to contact Hitler by way of his sister. This led to Hitler making special instructions which allowed Bloch and his family to leave the country with relative ease, and until they left, they would be under a level of protection by the Gestapo, who would make sure that they remained undisturbed as they prepared for their departure. As a result of the Bloch family's advantages, they were able to sell their house at market value, rather than at the low and unfair prices often forced upon the Jews, in part due to the Reich flight tax. Furthermore, they were allowed to exit the country with more money than Jews were often allowed, 16 Reichmarks, rather than the usual 10. At the end of November, the Bloch family, along with their son-in-law, were able to leave for Lisbon. From here, they headed to the US, settling in the Bronx in New York City. It was here in New York City that Eduard was approached by the Office of Strategic Service, which was looking for information about Hitler's past. Around this time, Eduard published the essay My Patient Hitler, now considered an important piece of writing when it comes to Hitler and World War II, as it showed him in a more human and down-to-earth way, dismantling the portraits which had been painted by British and American journalists. Before this, Hitler had only been portrayed as bad-tempered, rude, and melodramatic. Eduard meanwhile saw him as a boy who was an avid reader of Karl May and Fenimore Cooper with an interest in history and art. He showed Hitler to be a broken-hearted child devastated by his mother's illness. Part of his essay reads, quote, "As a youth he was quiet, well-mannered and neatly dressed. He waited patiently in the waiting room until it was his turn, then like every 14 or 15-year-old boy, bowed as a sign of respect, and always thanked the doctor politely. Like many other youngsters of Linz, he wore short lederhosen and a green woolen hat with a feather. He was tall and pale and looked older than his age. His eyes, which he inherited from his mother, were large, melancholic, and thoughtful. To a large extent, this boy lived within himself. What dreams he dreamt, I do not know." End quote. Though Eduard and his family had been able to escape the horrors of Nazi Germany, life in New York City was only a slight improvement for them. Eduard was no longer able to practice medicine, as his Austria-Hungarian medical license was not recognized in the US. Tragically, he died of stomach cancer in 1945, aged 73, a little under a month after Hitler's suicide and the end of the Second World War. Eduard is buried in Beth David Cemetery in Elmont, New York.